Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to this evening's seminar and roundtable where we're exploring high dynamic range as a storytelling tool. I'm James Bennett, Managing Director of Televisual, and your host for this online event, as organized by our good friends at Mission and Wildcat. This evening's session is not so much technology-led. We encourage you to lean on your more technically minded colleagues for this, but is more theoretical and practical. There may be a few technical terms, but we're not looking to obfuscate, but rather illuminate our theme. If we can correct a few misconceptions and impart some wisdom, we've done our job. And with a stellar panel of specular highlights, I hope we can do just that. Coming up, we have a 20-minute presentation from Simone D'arcangelo, DIT, cinematographer and CEO of Wildcat. His credits include Woody Allen's Café Society and A Rainy Day in New York. He's joined by Raffaele, colorist, whose credits include Woody Allen's Café Society and A Rainy Day in New York as well, very relevantly, as we'll find. And we have the maestro, Pablo Garcia, head of color at Mission, color supervisor for his Dark Materials and Downton Abbey. This is followed by an extraordinarily special 20-minute recorded presentation by Vittorio Storaro AIC. He's a triple Oscar-winning cinematographer. You'll know him best for The Last Emperor, Apocalypse Now, and again, he worked on A Rainy Day in New York. And we conclude this evening with a 45-minute panel discussion where our earlier presenters will be joined by Asa Shoul, colorist at Warner Brothers Delane Lee, whose credits include Mission Impossible, Fallout, and The Crown, and Devs. Angus Hudson, BSc, cinematographer, whose credits are on Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi, Mary Queen of Scots, and he was cinematographer, You Should Have Left. And Roberto Scheifer, ASC, AIC, another cinematographer whose credits include Quantum of Solace and Finding Neverland. And finally, our last cinematographer, Eben Bolter, BSc, with credits including the recent Avenue 5 and The Feed. And to start proceedings, I'd like to hand over to Simone. Simone.
Well, Adenine Cringe is, I think, introduce a new, very powerful expression tool. It's capable to creating true light and colors that we've never seen before. They trying to achieve this kind of effect since the Renaissance, when painters use the techniques like chiaroscuro to simulate the nuance of color in our eye. For more, for better result, they also use tools, very curious and technological tools like Caravaggio use lenses and convex lenses and mirrors to project picture on his canvas, and Vermeer at the same time use the camera oscura to reproduce much better the reality on his canvas. But the real limit on this kind of media is the canvas itself, because pigments can just reflect light. They can produce light like a display that we have. So there is a physical limitation on the canvas in painting that is, as biologists and specialized in vision science, John McCann says, we see object by sensing the light reflect to our eyes. Many diffuse reflection send light over a very wide angle. The amount of pigment, dye, or natural colorant in material controls how much of the illumination is diffusely reflected from an object. That's what happened practically on a canvas. John McCain calculated that we can reproduce just 32:1 contrast ratio. That, I mean, in photographical meaning is like just 5 stops. This kind of limitation forced the artist to make a creative dynamic compression process. So the artist has to decide how to synthesize these images of nature and use the limits to communicate power. As psychologist Chris Firth says, perception of the world is a fantasy that coincides with reality. So this kind of interest and the ability to read and interpret the visual system was one of the great reason to at the Crit Patch to make this revolution in stylistic revolution in 19th century. And this is what in Italy have the Machiavelli, for example, and probably most famous, the Impressionists, the French Impressionists. They painted canvas of pure color and light. They just use color to, and the intensity of light, the saturation of the color, to synthesize as an image that our mind can reconstruct and obtain a form. The ability to capture what the eye perceives in reality in sunlight as an extreme light power and that radiates an emotion. But the limit was clear. Cloud mirror, the black mirror, was one of the tools the landscape artists used in 17th centuries, is a proof of that. So this mirror practically reproduce as a physical characteristic that produce less defined, less saturated, and less contrast image, which contained the characteristics necessary to bring the perceived image that our eyes can see, high dynamic range, in a representation suitable for canvas, low dynamic range. And this is what probably in a more physical way can explain Pablo.
Thank you, Simone. Well, as James said before, this is mostly centered in the artistry, but we need to see some phenomena that is becoming really at age with HDR, and we're going to be a little theoretical in this next point. The topic I want to address is why there's so much fuss in the creative world about the consistency of image appearance in HDR. Maintaining perceptual appearance is one of the most complicated and advanced branches of study of the color science community. I think the color science community has never been this active as in these last 5 years. These studies are not based on how a display looks or a scene looks, but how it's perceived by an observer under certain viewing circumstances. Here are some of these effects, and what these studies are trying to solve, and we're going to see some examples of them. The first one is that brightness increases with saturation. We're talking about Rec 2020 and wider color spaces and so on. So this is an effect that we are seeing more and more often. Each color on the top has approximately the same luminance level, and yet they do not appear equally bright or dark. The yellow, second from the left, appears to be much darker than the magenta on the right. However, the top image, when it's converted to a grayscale, as you can see in the bottom, becomes as a single shade of gray. Another one that is very popular nowadays is the Hunt effect and the Stevens effect, where colorfulness increases with luminance and when contrast increases with luminance. And in here you can see a representation of the combination of the two of them. Another one, which is talking about the surrounding of a part of the image, says that the image contrast, especially on emissive images, such as images on an LCD display, increases with the luminance of the surround lighting. All of these squares from top to bottom, they have horizontally the same luminance, but you see how different they look depending on what they have as background behind them. The best example, in my opinion, is the dark, which in my opinion HDR is not just about highlights, it's actually more about what you can do with the shadows, and it depends very much on what is surrounding those dark objects. Another one, a little bit more complicated, is that the hue of monochromatic light changes with luminance to the eye. Light might change the perceived hue as its brightness changes, despite the fact that it retains a constant spectral composition. So the same hue, when you start increasing that brightness to your eye, will drift into looking like a different hue. And by the way, for those that are asking, what is a Troland? A Troland is a unit of conventional retinal illuminance. So that's the amount of actual light that is hitting the retinal. Another example that we can see in this animation is that the hue of monochromatic light also changes with the addition of white light to it. If we start adding white light to a hue, it will be perceived as a different hue. It not just gets brighter, it just actually shifts. And to finalize, and this is why it's so important, the viewing environment when we are judging pictures on a reference monitor or similar, is that the human color perception adapts to the white point of the illuminating source. In this next example, if you stare for about 20 seconds on the image on the left, in the cross between the lines, and then you look back at the dinosaur in the same cross, you will see that the color distortions disappeared, at least for a little while. So all of these phenomena, it's what perceptual transform engines integrate the various perceptual phenomena explained before into a model where all of these transforms are calculated. This ensures, or it pretends to ensure, that the creative intent of the reference master or the point of approval will be portrayed across all the different deliverables. Here you can see the first of these perceptual transforms or engines was Dolby Vision. Then you have the Colourist engine, which is actually quite advanced. And here you can see the logo of Lucid. Lucid is still experimental work from the University of Barcelona, the Pompeu Fabra, that is showing very promising results to deal with all of these phenomena. So I hope I haven't been too technical. It's just a theoretical thing. And these are things to consider when we are creating images and creating pictures and so on. And now I'm going to pass again the presentation on to Simone, which will introduce Anthony in a second. Simone, all yours.
Yeah, just a brief, experience in HDR that we had in 2017 when me and Vittorio and Anthony approached this new adventure with Woody Allen. It was the third actually in Rainy Day, New York. Because we had, during the DI, we had the experience to, finish the movie in HDR. We decided, we were very curious, and Vittorio also was very curious to see how we can achieve HDR also on set, because we thought that was very important, to follow this kind of workflow, this kind of picture, see this kind of picture since the beginning, since the production of the image. So at the time there wasn't any monitor that can, was available. But I mean, we found with Pablo actually in Sony in London, we found a solution with this BVM 17-inch that has a firmware that can get to 600 nits. And actually, we did some tests, and we were very, happy about it. And we use Prelight, because was, just one monitor. We can afford just one monitor. We decided to have HDR and SDR at the same moment. That was possible just with Prelight at the moment. And because you can, have to kind of different color journey and to different OATF. And we use, as always, Asses, as we, since the beginning, from Café Society, we approach since the shooting in production with the ISIS workflow. And it's practically our must for all the movies now on, and then we get this kind of setup that you can see here on the left. This is the Vittorio's setup. This is Vittorio's card where he can, you know, see the picture, control this light, and control also the iris of the camera. And this time he was able to see an HDR picture on his card, and you know, takes creative decision from there, seeing an HDR picture. And yeah, and together we build a look that we use since Café Society. We developed together with Anthony, and it was very strong also in Wonder Wheel, the second movie. And probably Anthony can explain better how this works with Baselight and all, you know, the work we did together. Anthony.
Thank you, Simone. Yeah, you know, to start at the beginning of our process with Vittorio, we start with his idea. He usually has a theme that connects to the story and a way to tell that visually. This is the seed of our look, whether you're emulating a specific stock, creating a period look, or experimenting with a new idea. It's always exciting, but you have to start with a good base. For our team, that's ACES. Working with it for the last 4 films now, we found that the universal color space not only provides us with great grading results, but also amazing archival and cross-platform sharing. As a general rule, I recommend testing these with your colorist and DIT to come to an understanding of the look. Simone and myself take Vittorio's notes, and we refine the look all the way through the DI process. But once you're happy, I would open this up to the director and production. Their input and understanding of this process is extremely important, because your look treats color tones and density and skin akin to how film stock would capture. All the more reason to use this look in your prep and your hair and makeup. This was the push for Vittorio's want to see HDR on set. He's always wanting the director and production to see the closest representation of the film look, so that they can make judgments on their particular part of the story. This is even more important when working in high dynamic range, as there are so many more possibilities. With a look, my goal is to get you 90% of the way there. You want it to be as close as possible, and 90% I feel is like an achievable thing. The color tones and overall density should be in the correct spots, but in the room, you'll see that you have total control of the image. Working in this scene referred environment, we'll give you the thickest negative, film or digital. And because you're doing this as an LMT, it will give you your starting point for SDR and HDR grades. Mission has, speaking of ACES, Mission has a great informative video about ACES on their YouTube and Facebook. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. In HDR, grading tools are often used to limit or enhance an effect given by a light source, low light areas, or by specular light. The effect they cause on perception can divert or direct the attention of the viewer from the point of the image or story in which the author wants to direct it. The grading software gives you so many tools to emphasize or limit high dynamic range effects, maintaining that control throughout. In the final grading, the expressive possibilities are endless, and it's a wonderful, like, new discovery process. This is our 4th film with the Storaro Allen collaboration. And then going into the grading process, the fundamentals in HDR are still the same. Our goal is to shape the image, to help focus the viewer on what's important in the scene and into the story. We're trying to move our story forward. Something Simone and myself have heard from Vittorio many times is follow the story. It's a simple phrase, but it resonates throughout our process. Within every scene, we discuss the characters and mood, making sure that we're linking back to that seed idea and look. Then use the grading software. By using the grading software, we help bring that emotion into the scene by focusing the viewer into a specific way and removing distracting elements. HDR's role in this process is there to facilitate that storytelling, and the range that we're discussing in a technical and theoretical way now become aesthetic choices. We're able to find more detail in places that we want it. And in cases where we don't want that detail, we're able to minimize it, or even in some cases remove those distractions. Color grading tool sets are extremely, extremely powerful. Questions in the room like, should we see what's in that window? Are the shadows deep enough? Is the saturation too rich? These types of questions are why Vittorio's mantra, follow the story, is so important, because that idea helps to answer these questions. It adds justification to subjective creative questions, something that I found to be extremely, extremely helpful in a collaborative creative process. As a storytelling device, HDR, in my opinion, is a gift. The opportunity that's given you to visually create mood and emotion is so much greater that these aesthetic choices can really help to bring out emotion in your story. I would urge people to look for those opportunities. Look for the moments where you can peek a sparkle in the eye to aid in your storytelling. Look for the moment where the shadowy figure slowly emerges from the dark. Use this tool and make your moments more impactful to the audience and help tell your story in a better way. Can't stress not, I want to stress not to be fearful of HDR and the dynamic range that it gives. Once you're done with your grading process, you move on to mastering, and mastering is the culmination of all that hard work. Now you can create any variation of that image you choose because of your preparation and use of scene referred working color space. The only note that I would have when creating different versions is there's a tendency to want to directly match the image from HDR to SDR. You want to be as close as possible without sacrificing your look. Try to make the best image that tells your story in the medium you're using. I found that you can lose the feel of your look by trying to fit those details back into SDR. Whether it's digital cinema, SDR, or HDR, all of them can embody the story that you're telling. Back to you, James.
Welcome back, folks. We've got one of the highlights of this evening. Vittorio Storaro, the great artist himself, recorded this piece only last night. Without further ado, let's hear from the master himself.
Well, speaking in a general sense about technology art, no doubt there is a history of, for example, if you let me tell you right away, the art is not only painting, it's not only sculpture. Art means, in Latin, means ability. So any kind of work, any kind of expression is an act of work, an act of art. Everybody is an artist. It depends on the level, it depends on the kind of fear that is going to act those kind of performance, let's say. But now, let's go into the film art, okay? Now, without any doubt, we have an incredible history in visual art, starting from the graffiti into the cave, starting on the painting on wood, starting on the little stone like the mosaic, start going through the painting on canvas, the discovery on a black and white emulsion, the photography, the movement between the black and white and color photography, and the chance to have more than one images in movement that becomes cinema. Going through that, we went through several composition into the cinema, and starting from almost the square image from early without sound image in the early century. We were going to the sound that started to be slightly a little bit more panoramic. In the 50s, the invention of the panoramic, the many different aspect ratio came through, from the one in France, 1 to 166, or the one in England and all around Europe in 185. Later, they discovered the fact that they need much wider screen in order to have the different from television image, so the CinemaScope, and after the 65 millimeter, and after the Silverama, and so on, and so on, and so on. Practically everything was a kind of evolution in one way, and sometimes was an involution, because not necessarily every different technology moved the artistic expression in the same direction. For example, when the film from mute going to sound, originally every cinematographer, like Billy Bitzer, for example, was trying to have the chance to move the camera in order to have the kind of movement that they did, trying to have this kind of completely change between photography and cinematography. They could do that at the early century. Later, when the sound came and the camera was noisy, they couldn't move the camera any longer right away. They have to invent the kind of blimp to move. If from when black and white we move in color, if black and white was give the chance to having the relationship between two main elements, darkness and light, at the beginning of the color age, particularly the advent of technical system, which was one of the best, absolutely, in my opinion, system to achieve from reality a virtual image in color. But the technology at that time, even the mind of the technical people, they were thinking that maybe in darkness the color cannot be captured very well. So they were pushing the art department, the costume department, the cinematographer to not have any kind of major difference between light and darkness. And there is an incredible amount of number of film in the 50, later 60, they're completely flat. Practically, they cancel the kind of dialogue between these two main elements, light and darkness, which means sometimes having conflict between two different concepts or sometimes an harmony between these different concepts. They were thinking the color can be done only in a stereo, in comedy or in musical, but not for dramatic film. Early 70, I think in Italy, in America, in France, so on, several cinematographers pushed this idea and started to use color in dramatic way. Because also we have some kind of example, I'm thinking personally myself about Michelangelo Merisi, called the Caravaggio, that in expressing himself in some particular painting, particularly the Colin of San Matthew, the one that really changed my own life, he was able to express some universal concept just with the mark of one beam of light into the darkness. Pradi was able to tell that life is made on these two major different positions, darkness and light, which means past and future, in conscious and superconscious, and what is the humanity and divinity at that level. So without any doubt, the chance the cinema has painting and photography with a long history to teach us, give an incredible input. Well, when 5 years ago, I have a call from Woody Allen for Café Society, and we discussed the chance to move between photochemical system to digital system. And I mentioned to Woody that both of us made several films, around 50 or 60 films each one, and mainly in photochemical, because even if I did some experiment or some test, I always thought that the chance the film to capture different tone was much better, was much give much more chance to see different tonality in deep darkness or very high luminosity compared to video, the electronic images. But at that moment, in 2018, honestly, because several laboratories was shut down, several company that was building films, they were closing their own office. And I said to Woody, let's be honest, we cannot run behind something that disappear in front of us. Practically, what is the concept of moving forward in our history is something that we cannot stop it. We can push it or we can slow down. So we started to filming in digital capture. I had some kind of little knowledge about some particular camera. I had the chance to have some assistant like the VIII that was helping me to know much better the new system. And we started to do this kind of expression. And also I understood that we were able to not only try to know better the system itself, but try to even to improve it. At that moment, there was a major conflict between many cinematographer, director, producer. Still, there are some of those kind of conflicts. The major question was, are we losing something? Well, in my opinion, according to my history or my example, no doubt it was originally in Italy till 1975 we were using the technicolor system, the Dolby system. There was a system that was given to us an incredible large number of tonality in color, as a saturation, and a different tonality between darkness and light and so on. When the system unfortunately stopped for the chance to move the industry in a much more simple and less expensive way, using only a monopack like any system like Kodak, Evert, Fuji, and so on. Yes, we gain the chance to have the camera much smaller, only one film, not three films, like was the original Technicolor system. We have a chance to have to arrive to do the first good print much faster than going to the metric system. But first of all, we lost without any doubt some kind of information in color tonality and color depth. But you know, it's the kind of difference that was when Leonardo da Vinci was painting on wood, and after when he paints on canvas and when he paints on the wall. There are different technology. Sometimes you gain something, you lose something. But at the same time, I realized that the camera that we were using, practically we were able to achieve 4K, a 16-bit depth color. Usually nobody take care of the number of bit color that you can record, but it's very, very, very important because the camera was able to, in 16-bit color, look like there was 200 billions of color shade being achieved. Yes, the film was able to do that. And when we were screening a film, we can see those kind of different chance of shade number in a screen. In digital, we cannot. Still today, the average video projector are arrived at today at 4K, but maximum 12-bit, which is only practically 60 millions of shade, not 200 billions. So what is the problem today? We have a chance to record a lot of information, but we are not able to show those kind of numbers of shade that can give it to us an images. I don't care in this moment the style of the image. If somebody was like to use a soft light, hard light, dramatic picture, a comedy picture, that's not the problem. That's something connected with the kind of style that between the director and cinematographer can understand what they need in order to convey to the language of light and the language of color the emotion to the audience, like the musician do that, like the writer do that. I mean, to have the chance to have the maximum larger number of tonality. Into those larger number, you can do whatever you like according to your taste or the need of the story. Well, I was pushing in a different master class in the few years in different places that we need to have video projector that are able to screen even when I go into a laboratory in Rome, in New York, in Los Angeles, or wherever. I cannot see exactly what I record. There is no one projector that show me exactly what all the color shade that we recorded. Well, I was pushing the company to say, please move your technology up. Go one more step. Give it to us the 16-bit color completely in screening. That's very complicated. Well, at one moment, the VIII that I work with started to talk to me about high dynamic range. And we went together in Los Angeles while we were doing a Café Society. I'm talking 2015 again, to see one example, the Technicolor Select, one of those kind of systems that was showing to us the chance to see deeper color tone and much contrast and more, let's say, color saturation. Unfortunately, the kind of presentation that I witnessed was not very well presented, because practically it was look like those kind of technology, HDR, was good for some particular film, for some particular story they need brighter light, much higher contrast, and great color saturation. And so I said, well, I don't like this presentation. Probably for some movie, for example, when I did Dick Tracy with the Warren Beatty, that kind of system was very, very welcome, in my opinion, if I didn't have the film at that time, because that was the direction of the story, the direction of this, the selection, a chance between myself and Warren Beatty, looking at the original, let's say, idea that the designer, Chester Goodhead, from the German Expressionist painters, practically they need those kind of conflict between primary color against the secondary color. So the HDR at that time was perfect, let's say. But in my opinion, later we started to introduce the chance to have HDR directly on the set, because that was the main discussion that I had between the color laboratory technician, colorist, and the digital image technician. The chance to not discover everything we are recording after we finish the HD digital intermediate, but knowing from the beginning. And we made, particularly in the second and third movie that we did with Woody Allen, the chance to watch it directly on the set or during the dailies we were doing. We were used to have all Saturday afternoon watching all, we were calling that weeklies, because during the day we don't have a chance to see. Also because having a very beautiful monitor, I can see exactly what I can record into that number that I mentioned before, not the 16-bit color, but at least 12. But practically I saw very clear what we were doing within the HD range, let's say. Well, honestly, we did have a perfect step forward at that moment. Not something that we discovered that was really the best way to do it in watching a HDR on the set and using any best color monitor watching dailies. because in order to really see what you have, you really need to have the particular monitor in HDR at that level that the monitor has that are into the laboratory. So only in that way we really were to be able to see exactly what we are achieving during the recording and what we can see during our dailies. If you don't have the particular equipment at that level, my personal experience was not very good. My personal experience was that I was not looking at what was expecting. Practically, I was much more comfortable in HD monitor on the set, on the dailies. Only when into the laboratory we finished the digital intermediate and we started to transfer on HDR. That was very interesting. But because, in my opinion, many cinematographers made a major mistake. They think that if the technician into the laboratory just transfer directly the master in HD, in HDR, they can see what they feel they can be better. That's not true, because not necessarily the choice that you're doing on the set, according to the story, according to the different sequence, is going exactly in the direction to have very high contrast, very high luminosity, and very color saturated. Probably you can have in one particular film the entire movie moving in that direction, or you can have the kind of chance to move from one tonality to another according to the story, according to the drama, according to the different plays, according to the different character. So you need to work to practically to maybe making the specific correction when you move from HD to HDR according to your style of the picture. So this is the only way that you can do one step forward. So practically at that moment you have much more range of tonality, and you can play your story in your vision, in your style, with a large range of tonality. That is the best way. So my goal is if we can have a video projector in HDR in every theater, and you can do your digital intermediate in HDR, that would be the best solution. We need during the shooting have to have a very close quality of monitor on the set, or when you're watching the dailies that you have in the laboratory. Otherwise, personally, I didn't feel comfortable in that way. But no doubt the HDR can be the best solution to have the chance to see everything we record, because practically can show to us all the 16 bits that we recorded. That's, I think, in my opinion, the best way we can do. And I'm sure that company, technology will go in that way. But I think there is a need, the cinematographer particularly, a director as well, they need to very careful know the system. They don't take that for granted. You put just a big monitor into your set, and everything you imagine is exactly what you needed, because you have to arrange any kind of look, let's call it, according for the particular style of the picture, a particular kind of wave, like in literature, like in music, that you move from image in very soft color tone, and probably you move in very medium or higher color tone or contrast and so on, according to the story. So practically you need to know the system, and you need to know, first of all, you need to have an idea. Because most of the time, I can read the interview the cinematographer are doing, and they say, "Oh, I go to the set without any previous idea because I don't want to lose the emotion when I am on the set." I don't think this is the best attitude. I think that you need to be prepared. You need to read very carefully the story, to have a particular translation in your mind between literature and vision, and to present the main visual concept to the director, to have his approval. And after, when you are on the set, you already have a very solid platform that you can work on. Nobody can stop you to change, to have a different emotion if you need to, but you cannot arrive on the set and not knowing what to do. That's ridiculous, in my opinion. And in order to know better everything, yes, step by step, apart, study the meaning in philosophy about the light and shade, about every single color tone. After, you need also to know the technology that you are using. Practically, in my opinion, the famous line equilibrium, harmony, is the most important thing between those two lines, technology and creativity. Knowing the psychological, symbolic or physiology reaction, the every different lights, every different color can give to the human being, which this is something scientific and not something that I invent. Hippocrates was the greatest doctor in Greek time, told to us that the chance that we can change our metabolism, the blood pressure, if we change the emotion according to the kind of light or the kind of color that reach our body, not our eyes, our body. So, in my opinion, you cannot be improvise this kind of profession. This kind of profession required determination, required study, require research in both areas, the creativity and the technology. Have a good time.
And we're back.
Well, that was something special. I decided to pick up on a couple of things that Vittorio has shared. The first is, and I think very importantly to what we're discussing, cinematography is part of a broader and continuously evolving history of art, of human expression through light and color. I think it was a really interesting point Vittorio made about the history of cinematography is a mix of technical advances, but they're sometimes held back by expediency and practicality. The desire is now for better and better presentation platforms as we're acquiring images with up to 16 stops of dynamic range. I think this idea of what that presentation platform actually is was a key element of what Vittorio was expressing. There are some other points which I'd like to pick up on, one of which is HDR is the canvas and the palette, and it's about horses for courses. Vittorio picked up on Dick Tracy and how, for example, Dick Tracy would be somewhere where you might want to push light, you might want to push the luminance and the color, and would have perhaps been a better film, a much stronger film, that, you know, because it has those strong, bright primary colors. And at the same time as that, he's also saying just because you have the canvas, because you have the palette, you don't need to use it all of the time. It's not about let's push it till it breaks every time. Sometimes it's about holding back. It's about having that greater range of light and color tonality with an HDR. The key here is tonality, is that you have a better way of expressing your story, of telling that story. But the real key, I think, to the real take home here is that preparation is absolute. I'm going to quote the last line again. You cannot improvise. You require determination, study, and research in the art and the technology. Now then, I'm joined again by our panel, and we are now joined by Asa Shoul, Angus Hudson, Roberto Schaefer, and Evan Poulter. Now, I'm going to kick it off with Asa. Asa, it wasn't so very long ago that you and I were discussing the series Debs. Rob Hardy made a statement there, which I thought was very interesting. He said, you find your look and your movie in the prep room. Can you expand on what exactly Rob was getting at there? What was he trying to say, and what was your involvement?
My involvement on that project, well, most projects is hopefully at script stage. I'd always ask for a script. There isn't always one. There wasn't for the last Mission movie. But there was for devs, and it was just a stunning piece. And we'd start discussing that even before we're doing camera tests. But then there'd be camera and lens tests, costume, makeup, and different bodies. We went for the Sony Venice, and in all of those, we're looking for those almost imperceptible moments when we go, that's the film. That there, the relationship between the actor and the surroundings, the light, the length of shot and everything, and how the script works together in the editing, it's all part of it. But that's where we discover, and we continue to throughout the shoot and the grade, and it evolves, constantly. We discover things, which is why in a series like that, what you really want to do is have all 6 or 10 episodes live at the same time. Of course, if you're doing a movie, you'll have the entire movie and you can go back and forth, discover, find something later, bring it back to the beginning or other scenes. With the TV series, quite often you'd be delivering episodes and then you kind of face with regret what you couldn't do to earlier ones. With streaming services like Netflix and others now, we usually have 6 or 10 episodes live all at the same time, working across them, as I was today on The Crown season 4, going back to the first 3 episodes. And that discovery, you'll always remember things, and I refer back to tests we've done, and often images. We might go to art galleries, or Rob or Alex, director, DOP, editors, costume designers, will show references of other artwork they found, and you'll always be referring back to that. What was good? Why did you throw it away? Why did you involve it in the piece? So I think we always hold on to or look back to things that inspired us or got us excited early on in the project.
I recall for Debs, for example, you're referring very much to a book that you'd found called Neon Tigers.
Oh, yeah.
And tell me about how did that, and I've had a look since. I've had a look at the images, they're extraordinary, and I can see how they informed that movie. But what was your thinking there?
So in those, they're long minute, they're like 10-minute exposures of various cities, Hong Kong, Singapore, at night. And there you have a completely different look, because the city suddenly looks almost like daytime, and the quality of lights on in buildings as well as the light from surrounding looks like a completely kind of unknown and unseen landscape. In devs, what we found was you'd have cutaways between scenes to the city at day and at night, lots of them at night. And I just felt with Rob, we were trying things out, and I had these references, and I thought, can we make those as interesting and as a character within the film, in the same way that we do when we then cut into an office or a room or wherever it may be. And in doing that, and brightening them and lifting them as much as the Venice would allow, and often further, we would then talk to the editor again, because we discovered this on season 3 of The Crown and on other HDR shows, that you might have a 4-second or a 5-second establishing shot of a city. But in HDR, because it becomes 3-dimensional and there's so many points of interest within it, and Rob is a big fan of points of interest, that shot could be held for 10 seconds or 15 seconds and become a completely different part. It could become a scene on its own. And so we would go back to the editor and say, could we try this a bit longer? And they might even go back to the composer and say, instead of a little sting here, we've actually got time for, something else. So that's where those came in. And having done that, Rob then said, could we introduce that boost in brightness and that sort of extreme idea into all the other scenes, which was not something I was planning. But that's when the extent of how we use the dynamic range came in. I've never used it to that extreme, and not gimmicky. It just felt right. There were times when we were super dark and there was nothing, but other times when we just that expanse. And I think it had a lot to do. I don't know if we could do that on a sort of London police drama, but on something in San Francisco or maybe in South Africa with that extraordinary light where you could see from a helicopter 50 miles across the city, it became the perfect tool for that film.
Well, if I can, I'd love to encourage everyone to see, there's a film that you can find at televisual.com. I'm sorry for the plug, but it actually relates directly to this. where we have Rob and Asa, but we actually see some of the shots, albeit streamed in SDR. And I would go so far as to say that there are shots of San Francisco, the one particularly of the San Francisco in the fog, and I would be very happy if I saw that in a gallery. I really would. It's the most
amazing,
beautiful image.
Yeah.
It's absolutely exquisite. And I'll ask you to take a different approach here before we move on, which is, again, thinking about the crown. I recall when you're talking about the crown and grading the crown in HDR, that you rarely pushed it above 400 nits, and that you clamped it all down rather than using all of that. The very antithesis, if you will, to Debs. Tell me about regrading series 1 and 2 and in HDR. And
yeah, so one and 2 were SDR only, and then we went on to 3 and we were doing that in HDR, and then they asked us to regrade 1 and 2 for HDR. And at that time, the filmmakers, everyone was rather nervous of HDR, which I think we've all come across at different times, less so now, which is wonderful. And it was just this tiny adjustment because everyone, you know, we had the look, we were happy with it, and it worked beautifully for the storytelling. And a lot of it was about people being in dark rooms, being trapped by their environments, struggling for enlightenment and to reach the light and break out from their, you know, restricted lives.
If I can cut across here, do you think that's to do with the intent as well? If the intent wasn't to have an HDR deliverable on series 1 and 2, to then suddenly start pushing it, and I don't know, and I have mixed feelings about Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now being an HDR print. I don't think that was his intention. To give it that Netflix look, if you will.
No, and it doesn't always work. We tried it on Isle of Dogs, and I was doing some work on that because they were looking at an HDR delivery and showed Wes what we could do, and he was really impressed by the depth that the image got, but it wasn't what he'd planned. It wasn't what he'd lived with for 3 years, and so he just decided not to do that. Similarly with Edgar, he was very nervous about his Cornetto trilogy being turned into HDR, which was done in the States, and we were watching it here and making adjustments, and he was really shocked by what was distracting him and everything. So we didn't do the visual effects to see this, that, and the other. We did it for other reasons. So you have to be very respectful of the story and of the cinematographer's intent. That's just number one. On season 3 of The Crown, we started with HDR, and certain directors were more nervous than others. So again, we were slightly restrained on some of them, but it did start to open it up. And now on season 4, it's really taken on a new range, and we're using it much more, and always mindful. It just can't be a distraction. It has to help storytelling, and that's it really with HDR. And so you'll find that HDR can be anything from, SDR just above to, really extreme, depending on the scene, what you're trying to do, what you're trying to emphasize. And you can spend more time just taking away light because it's distracting rather than, embracing it if it doesn't work for the scene.
I'm gonna bring Roberta Schaefer in here. Roberta, and you've got an extraordinary body of work, and an amazing body of work. Tell me about your experience of and how you approach that prep room, and again, what difference bringing HDR into that mix gives you as a cinematographer. Let's start in the prep room. And what are you looking for in the prep room?
The prep room for me is weeks, hopefully weeks of just sitting with the director and going over the script, shot by shot, line by line, I should say, storyline in continuity form, and plotting out how to shoot the movie. Understanding that you're going to get into differences when you get on set with the actors changing things or whatever, but at least having a graphic image, like a timeline, a visual timeline of how you want to tell the story. So you know where the ups and the downs are, you know where you're going to go brighter, darker, camera movement, types of lenses. So that's all planned out beforehand. And with the production designer, deciding all of those, the looks, because their production designer is often on before the director of photography is. And I'd say also costume design is important to make sure that everybody's on the same page and moving the same direction and understanding where they're going. The ironic thing is that I've had no pre-production experience with HDR. I've only had slap in the face. Oh, after we've done our pass, or they say, oh, now we're gonna do the HDR pass. And I go, what are you talking about? What HDR pass? They say, oh, we're doing an HDR pass. I go, well, that would have been nice to know when we're shooting it, because there's things we would have taken into, into mine. And we would have wanted, I would have requested an HDR monitoring on the set. And they said, well, too bad. And the big N wants an HDR pass. So I go, okay, that's not NBC either. I said, okay, and Anthony, we're stuck there. Suddenly it's like, okay, this movie's going HDR. Of course, part of the reason on the Red Sea Diving Resort was that it was not a streaming movie to begin with. It was a motion picture for theaters that then got bought by the major streamer because they couldn't sell it for many reasons at a big enough price to the market. So my experience with HDR has really been after the fact. I did a movie that was actually paid for by Netflix, and we did for them after the Red Sea Diving Resort, called Rattlesnake, which was only been on Netflix, and it's a fun, a chasing time thriller movie, horror movie. They didn't tell us about HDR either there. That was an after the fact. I did the post, and then they said, oh, we're doing an HDR pass. The thing that we did on that was we really used it so minor, just the moments where it really had an effect, which was basically this really gorgeous, we hit the best sunset ever in New Mexico. Just, we got lucky. Did a long 4-hour, I think, pass of the time on Sony Venice, which has great, I've loved the color science on the Sony Venice. I love the stretch, the latitude, I love everything about that camera, and the physicality of it as a, having to operate too, and where you can stick the Rialto. But afterwards, so we did this where you actually see the ball of the sun, which in the SDR pass, you could not define it. It just became a glob of light, which was nice, but it really, the sunset with the clouds and everything, the HDR really pushed it there. The rest of the movie didn't need HDR in a sense. So we didn't really do anything. And, they have I guess you guys, Asa and Anthony, better than I do, a tool where you do your HDR pass and then you plug it in and it does an HDR conversion. They say it's better to do that than to do the HDR pass and then convert back to SDR.
I'm gonna reference Anthony and Asa on this, and I have my own feelings on this as well. But what I would like to say is I've seen Rattlesnake and I've seen it in HDR, and I completely agree that sunset is to die for. It's a beautiful moment. It is absolutely exquisite.
It's the cloud movement and everything there was just so spectacular, and it fit the movie so perfectly. I can send you a still of it if you like. I have a nice one from there. But Anthony and Asa, as far as that goes, that's what I've been told. I'm under the impression that it's better to do your. Also, I think 90% of the world sees SDR at this point, at least the United States.
That's right.
I mean, HDR here
it's going higher, but it will be on 70%, 75% at least.
In the US or the world?
Worldwide.
Probably in the US. Actually, the pandemic is probably helping. People are going out and buying bigger TVs and better TVs because they're staying at home more.
Yeah.
Now, I'm gonna come on to the same question. I'm gonna bring in Eben at this point. Eben, are you there? Are you with me? Have you been working in HDR, and tell me about that experience?
Did you say how long?
I know. Have you been working in HDR, and tell me about that experience in the prep?
Yeah.
I think this is key.
Yeah, I mean, I've done 3 TV series in HDR, and I've just shot my first movie in HDR, which we had on the set, monitoring HDR and SDR, which we can talk about separately. And yeah, for me, like everyone, I mean, I don't want to repeat so much of what's been said before, but I think that the way I kind of got my head around HDR was to think of it as a delivery platform. It's about televisions at the moment, ultimately, and it gives us this sort of opportunity to present work with more contrast, with brighter highs and darker lows and sort of more color. So it's sort of there to use if we want to, as someone said before. And it's about, we have this sort of new opportunity to get into this unknown territory. And as a cinematographer, it's become, on every project, it's become about, just because we can doesn't mean we should, So if we want to paint in watercolors, let's go low contrast and let's shoot this story the way it should be shot. And then when we get to HDR, let's make it the best version of that, but let's make it that. Let's not, pull everything up and pull everything down and make it kind of all crazy. just because we can. So as I've done more and more work, I mean, the Netflix film I've just done is a sort of Los Angeles set, you know, neon noir. It's all about color. It's all about neon signs. And suddenly it was, you know, suddenly we've got this opportunity to you know, brighten the physical pixel color of a red neon sign, rather than it starts to burn out to go white, rather than it's, you know, everything we know about how you know, as reds get brighter and brighter, they get into pink, they get into white. That's how painting works. That's how we sort of understand brightness and color. Suddenly I can hold on to a really primary red and just turn that pixel up and make that red that much brighter. And I mean, that's just completely unknown territory. So as a cinematographer, I'm sort of scared of that, but I'm also really interested in it. And, you know, that's such an opportunity to do something new. It just has to be for the right story. And you know, I'm sort of on every project, I'm getting a little bit braver and sort of figuring out my taste. But again, like I said at the beginning, you know, I don't want to be sort of forced to stretch things and push things. And if someone wants to do a low contrast black and white movie, then great, and let's just make it look good on everything. But it should look.
If I can pull you back to the prep room again, and when you're prepping for HDR,
yeah.
And is it a different process than for SDR? Are you looking for different elements? How does it differ? And you know, the prep room's familiar to most of our audience as cinematographers. How does it differ from your experience of working for HDR?
Yeah, I mean, so on this film, it's probably the best example. We just realized we knew we wanted to be bold, we knew we wanted to be colorful, and we were looking at all of these photographic references, and we were just sort of talking about how brave do we go, how super colorful do we go, how much do we sort of step into that unknown, and what does that look like? So we had some long distance testing. Jill Bogdanovich at Company 3 in Santa Monica, who had just colored Joker, and so we wanted to start with the sort of 35 mil LUT, as we often do, as a sort of starting point. And we just wanted to look at how we could sort of step into that unknown, bold, bright color profile. And what we ended up doing was a sort of, we developed an HDR LUT that gave us a general 70% pull down. So we were sort of peaking our brightest whites at 70% of what was available. And I personally thought that gave us a very just sort of rich, full cinematic look, but it didn't look particularly HDR. And then we sort of reserved the right to use that top end 30% for if we're looking into the sun, or if there's a billboard we really want to ping with color. But the interesting thing is, I mean, I've prepped it. I actually haven't finished the movie because of you know, the situation we're all in. So I'm going back to finish it in a couple of weeks, and I haven't got to the grade on that yet. But our plan was all about sort of pushing it a little bit further than we were sort of comfortable with, and being bold and brave.
Brilliant. I'm gonna bring in Angus now. Angus, are you there? Are you with me?
I am. I'm here.
Marvelous, Angus. And again, have you had much experience with HDR in the prep room?
In the prep room, no. I mean, you know, you ask the question, so what deliverables do you need? And they say, just SDR, just SD, just HD, nothing special. And yeah, and then on the first HDR film I graded 3 days before the grade, when the DI suite was booked, we got the projection thing going, and it's all, oh, by the way, we want an HDR now. And you say, really? I mean, really? It would have been nice to know. I mean, I did ask you a year ago, and you said no. And then we don't have an HDR suite available to us, so we have to do it in a DI suite. And then we're finding our feet a bit, and it takes me back to when I first visited Pablo at Mission Digital for one of their quite early HDR sessions, where I had a little play and I sat down next to, they were demonstrating it with their fancy, really expensive monitor and all their toys, and they show us how it can look, and you go, ooh, that's a bit dialed up to 11 for me, and it goes against 35 years of an aesthetic, and then I say, can you do this? Can you just do that? And then I grade it to my aesthetic. And then I look at all the dials and discs and numbers, and it actually looks exactly like an SDR image.
Yes, it did.
Just because my natural aesthetic takes me there. It drags me back into, you know, it's sort of burnt into my retina, or actually no, HDR burns it into your retina, but there is sort of something burnt into my mindset about what an image should look like, and it shouldn't look like that. So it's kind of, so I did this project, actually with Sim, actually, it was sort of a film called You Should Have Left. And it, you know, we didn't expose for it. It was a difficult film. We had lots of very bright backgrounds. So we kind of reined it in a bit, and we didn't turn it up to 11. We turned it up to about 9. And we kept it in a quite a SDR kind of version, but with just a little bit more something. And at that time, it was a something that is not necessarily, I couldn't really describe, but it just was a bit of an extra something. I was very naive about it all, and we had a great colorist, Lucy Barbier, and you know, we sort of explored it and discovered it together, and and we didn't have a lot of time because we just didn't. And then then the next project that came along, I got into a thing where we said, what are your deliverables? And they said, I don't know. And we said, well, okay, we're going to allow for HDR. We are going to allow for it. And I don't know what allowing for it really looks like, but we're going to allow for it. So I had, I sat down with my DIT, or actually not my workflow guy, a guy called Francesco Giardello, who sort of knows that kind of stuff. And we designed a LUT, and we didn't have a post company on board, so sadly no colorist. So it was just Francesco and me sitting there going, what do you reckon? Oh, that looks nice. And we did it on an HDR monitor, and we allowed for it. And then the DIT we had with us when we were shooting, it was shot in Italy. We allowed for, we basically exposed for it but we didn't have an HDR monitor on set because we didn't know whether we were going there. I knew we would, but we didn't. And so finally, you know, we end up grading the film. And yes, of course, you know, Netflix buys the film. Of course, it goes HDR, and we feel we've got our asses covered, and we kind of have. And then lockdown happens, and we end up grading from my basement, from this very room here, live drone with a 4K SDR Flanders 55-inch monitor stuck just there, blinding me for 10 hours a day in here. And it was an amazing experience. But what I found in that first week, again, we hadn't prepped for it, as you were saying, James. You know, we hadn't actually prepped. What I found was, it's a bit like discovering fermented food for the first time. In that you're not quite, you taste it and you think, oh, I'm not quite sure about this, and you've got to learn to appreciate it a bit. Yeah. You get that flavors come through, and then you start to get into, you know, sort of how umami-ish can you go? Then you actually then you find that bit of umami, and you go, that's actually rather nice. And we got through the first week, and then we had a day off, and we came back, and then I discovered I'd had a moment of reflection, and I went back and then we just tried a little bit more, I don't know, sort of pickled cabbage in there. And all of a sudden, this amazing depth came out. It opened itself up, and we found a vibrancy that I hadn't really discovered before within the week of exploring.
Is this an epiphany for you? Are you now a convert? And having spent 35 years in an SDR universe, has this additional stops? Has it broadened?
I mean, I think the SDR universe, I mean, prior to SDR, I think something about seeing a print projected, there's something a bit more, there's HDR plus when you see a good print projected. I mean, really? I mean, HDR isn't that new. Prints were good. When prints were good, they were really good, but they just stopped being good quite quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. But absolutely. I'm gonna bring in Pablo. Pablo, are you ready now? I'm gonna bring in Pablo. You have an extraordinary experience in HDR, and crikey, the number of productions that you've done in HDR is extraordinary. What would your advice be in terms of that preparation for HDR? What would you suggest? You know, 3-4 take-home points. What would you suggest to the cinematographer going into an HDR prep?
As many people have said before, sit down with your DIT and with your colorist, work on the look, have a look at it on HDR, even though that you're not going to have an HDR monitor on the set. and have the best test material that you can, the one that is closest to your final lighting, if you can. It's gonna be repeating what most of the people said. It's the same that Asa said about limiting or just holding the horse for those 400 nits and so on. We did the same with the design of the look for David Hicks in his Dark Material season 2. He went on to 650, but we built into the Showlat, onto the LMT that Anthony was explaining before. We built a roll-off on that end, so he knew that it was not going to go any further than this. But if you need to, it's very easy to actually pull, and for that particular scene, then you can just pull that onto that 11 that we were talking about. But prep is it's been the long forgotten for too long, and one of my mentors used to say that lack of prep is preparing for failure.
Mm-hmm. So prepare to fail.
Correct. And I think it's something that is worth investing the time, worth investing the learning curve, and just trust in your team, trust in your colorist, trust in your DAT, and just have that epiphany on your own. It's an experience. The HDR. There's same thing with many grades that I've been doing it with cinematographers. The first time they go really shy and they keep it on the SDR looking alike. So they just copy paste what they were doing before. And as Angus said, they started like, actually for the second one, yeah, let's push it more on this, and you start seeing it within the script and to help the storytelling. And there are some times that you're gonna push it more, and then sometimes you're gonna hold it and you're gonna keep it all on the SDR. So yeah, and you need to see it in black and white. It's incredibly beautiful.
I'm gonna move the debate on here at this point, I think, and I'm gonna start exploring one of the things about HDR. It's slightly counterintuitive almost, that that people think about HDR in terms of brightness, and actually isn't one of the great strengths of HDR. It is actually the additional stops in the shadows, because the human eye has an extraordinary capacity to see detail in the shadow. For example, when you walk into a cinema and your eyes adjust, and you can see those different degradations within the shadows, within that dark interior, and your eyes adjust to it, and you get that extraordinary detail. If you increase the stop of light in the bright, when in a bright scene, that stop of light isn't as closely experienced as that one stop in dark. I think this is a very common misconception that people think of it always in terms of luminance, of brightness, of who are any of my panelists? Would you like to extemporize? Would you like to follow through on this? Anyone would like to comment on what it can do in the dark? Evan, you look like you're going to come in here.
Well, it's interesting because I've got this sort of thing about, I love darkness, as I'm sure we all do, and it's funny, if you ever see a sort of list of, greatest shot films of all time, or on the oneperfectshot.com, so often it's a silhouette. And there's something about darkness that's inherently cinematic. The Godfather, you think of deep dark shadows, and so I'm really sort of battling with that at the moment in my own head, because I sort of, there's something about the definitiveness of black that's just really sort of sexy and cinematic to me and really interesting. And so I don't necessarily want to give too much of that up, so the curve that we were using on the film I just did was actually quite sort of harsh at the bottom end, because I did actually personally want things to fall away relatively quickly, and I didn't actually personally want to use all of that potential range down there. But again, I think that's just a sort of a new thing, and maybe I'm just not brave enough to sort of go there. I don't know what anyone else thinks.
Would anyone else like to comment on that point about the detail in the shadows? Simone, when you're doing Rain Day in New York, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not a super bright film, is it? This is not a. This is and yet you're working in HDR. It's not about a luminous super color primary color film. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. We keep the colors really shy. Someone said before, because it was all in New York during a day of rain. So Vittorio didn't think that colors were play a big role on this movie, but light plays a big role. That's why HDR was very important to us, because we can play with the contrast of clouds and the bright lights between the New York Manhattan with the reflection and the streets. And it was very interesting to really to see how HDR reacts on set, because you can really see a picture that is interesting for us in the way we build the look for the movie itself. And yes, was just very in a contrast ratio more than colors. And then we play with Anthony during the DI a lot with this kind of contrast. I think it was an interesting HDR grading.
Anthony, I'd like to bring Anthony in at this point, and he's been quiet for too long. I know
I'm never this quiet. I've been antsy, touching my beard, and moving all around. It's one of the things about HDR, and I think Simone hit on it, at least for me, is the actual contrast ratio, the ability to have contrast in the low level and the high level and maintain those gradations of detail. That to me is really what I find interesting about HDR. Everyone's always like, let's pop, show them the specular highlights. And they're like, okay. And most people, myself included, that's not necessarily what I want. I want, like, Angus was saying, a little bit more, that little special something. And you're aiming for this contrast ratio between keeping your SDR feel, but having that Christmas, almost three-dimensional negative feel is what I find is very interesting. Creating that kind of almost depth that you would find in a print is what I'm looking for.
Exactly, because contrast itself is if you see an object in the distance, it's not your interocular, the distance between your two eyes, that defines its three-dimensionality. It's contrast that first and foremost defines the three-dimensionality. And if you see an object 2 miles away and yet you've still got a perception of three-dimensionality, that's contrast, that's not interocular.
Absolutely.
And there's a comment, talking to Pablo, and I've heard from many people as well, is that there's also a joy to HDR for black and white, for monochrome, for black and white films. There's a joy there. And Pablo, I'm going to bring you in here, because I know that you're a big fan of this idea of contrast, that contrast ratio in a black and white film, giving it that extra dimension. And what's that about? What do you think?
Well, I had because at the time that I was working at Sony, the prototype of the X300, which has become kind of the de facto and that first reference monitor that is in many of the studios, was sent to me in 2016, late 2016, early 2017. At that time, I was doing a really tiny, small feature film done in monochrome with the red, and I was all in a color managed workflow, even though it was black and white, but I could actually change the outputs and so on. And I suddenly thought, like, I got this HDR monitor here. What it would be to see black and white in HDR. HDR, it's everybody's thinking, oh yeah, the colors there, but what we are more sensitive to is actually to the grayscale. So how would this be? So I decided to do, for my own joy, a full pass on HDR, and I watched the whole film, and I couldn't believe it. The three-dimensionality that just those black and white pictures suddenly, it was coming out of the screen. If you get all that chroma and everything else out, and you work on that depth, and I've done it as well in some actually color HDR works that I've done. It's just like taking the chroma out and then seeing the depth that I'm getting, and just putting things. It just separates so much background to foreground, and then you bring the color back, and it's like, okay, yeah, it's there. but really, and then Cuarón did Roma, which was on Netflix, and please watch it in HDR if you can.
Beautiful.
And yeah, so you can see that. But yeah, I had that chance of doing it a few years before, and I couldn't believe it. I was going to everybody like, you need to see black and white in HDR, man. It's amazing. But I haven't managed to do it again. But yeah, it was a great experience, and as we've seen here, it's a learning curve for everybody. I think Roberto has.
Now I'm going to bring in our two colorists.
James, can I just add?
Yes, Roberto.
Talking with Anthony, since we did this movie called The Red Sea Diving Resort together, and part of that movie, the script says, on a beach at night, Africa, a moonless night. Okay. Shooting black Ethiopians being taken away in black Zodiacs by Israeli SEALs in blackface. So I shot with the Panasonic Varicam, and I shot some of it at 10,000 ASA. I shot some at 5,000, 8,000, various things. We used the base light because you could change you could debarrier it on the fly right in there. But I never heard, because it went to Netflix. Anthony, did you ever end up doing an HDR pass on it? Because we didn't do one together. Did they do one? Because
I never did an HDR pass on that. They had sent it out without it. I don't know if they had taken it and done it somewhere again.
Which wouldn't, that's the thing that scares me when, and it happens not just with HDR, but on other things. And I'll just say I'm jealous of Eben, and I had similar with Angus, where I don't even know who the post person is, who the post facility is going to be when we start shooting. So we do prep. We have no idea where the DI is going to be done.
Quick plea.
It happens too often.
Bring the cinematographer into the grade, please.
Yeah. Yes. Well, no, not even bringing into the grade, letting us know who's going to grade. Let us know who's going to grade it.
Yeah,
we don't even know.
Asa, you're well timed on screen here. I'm going to bring you in because one of the things that came up just earlier on, I do want to return to this. And you and I were both shaking our head at the time, I recall, but it's about the pecking order when you're in the grade. The Dolby Vision HDR conversion route. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, because I am a convert of that methodology. I'm absolutely convinced by that methodology, and that is the Netflix preferred route as well, importantly, and indeed Amazon. So please, can you explain to everyone watching what that entails?
Well, basically, you do an HDR pass first, and once you've done that, you do a Dolby analysis, which is automatic, and then you have your trim pass, which gives you just a single layer of basically lift, gamma, gain, saturation. In version 4 Dolby, there are more tools; it's much better, but we're kind of moving from 2.9 to 4, and that's for your SDR. You've got it all on one timeline, so you're not rendering anything down. You've got all your shapes, windows, everything available. You can go back and tweak the HDR and then the SDR. It's all can be done at the same time. If that's for Netflix, and then it's an IMF file with the XML, which is for the different variants between the curve. Pablo can probably explain this better, from 100 nits all the way up to 1,000 nits. You can definitely explain it better. If they're separate, if you're told, right, we want an HDR and we want an SDR, but don't worry about them being Dolby Vision, you can treat them as two completely separate things. On devs, the SDR didn't have to be the same, but I still did a Dolby analysis and trim as that first stage to go to the SDR. On the Crown, just slightly going back to having the DP in the suite, which for 6 months I haven't had now until recently, I'd do the HDR first on my own as a balance, and then get that ready for the Crown, knowing the kind of look as a basic thing, then do the Dolby analysis and trim to get the SDR ready for the DP and director. And we do that through a Soho net system called Clearview, where I'm grading live. They're watching it on their iPad Pro, hopefully, because they're very good, very stable, very consistent with certain settings and lots of things turned off. And then we sign that off. And then there's the problem of, okay, that everyone's happy with that for now. And I go back to the HDR again and do a trim to that, making sure that it's not outlandishly different from the SDR they've seen. And then recently get them in for a kind of 1 day Are you happy with the HDR? And we might tweak that again. So we've been going back and forth and back and forth. The great thing about Clearview during this, which I'm going to take forward forever, is the ability to have the DP in the suite, no matter where they are in the world, because there's so many times you'll finish a shoot and the DP's off prepping or shooting something else, and I'll never see them. And as strong as I think I am with my experience in a suite, if you're left alone without a DP and a load of execs, it can go badly wrong. And usually just, not even talking HDR, everything just, they want to lift and see under the table and all the rest of it. So having the DP with you, even if they're on a boat somewhere, which I had the other week, or in Mauritius or Canada or wherever, is absolutely vital. But I'm sort of horrified to think that Roberto and Angus having situations where they don't know where the post is going to be, because this is part of me getting involved early in testing and getting scripts, is because we're part of the camera team. I just think of myself as another tool that should be tested as you would test a sensor and a lens and a filter and everything as early as possible. And you might not use me at the end, but that's the, that's the way that these things
as the market develops, and it's a vision that I know that Mission share, and is this idea of actually a joined up color management from pre through production
all the way through
post. So rather than you receiving a raft of a raft of assets where the LUT has proved not fit for purpose, let's say, you're working in TLs on an ACES pipeline, and you're going back, and it's a dynamic process where you're actually directly involved with the camera department, and that's kind of like the holy grail, isn't it, that we're moving towards? And I'm going to ask you two questions which are very relevant, because if you did start with an SDR and then did an HDR pass, you are actually grading twice almost. One of the other aspects of this HDR and Dolby Vision conversion is this idea of efficiency as well, and time efficiency in the grade. Is that right?
Yes. No, it's a very efficient way of doing it. I mean, the only difficult thing is if you do HDR first, it's hard not to be disappointed when you then do SDR. And on every project I've done, Devs is a classic one. Alex, when we switched to SDR, just said, is that broken? And you are looking at this image. It's a bit like if I've been doing TV projects for 6 months and then I do a feature film, like the other day, turned on the projector. I can't believe it's right because the black is so lifted. I mean, it's just a really shocking, and you've got 14-foot Lamberts. And then after half an hour of working, everyone's eyes back into what white now is, what the peak is, and what blacks are on that range. And you're kind of like, oh, it's okay now. But it is always sort of a disappointment going that way. I've never done a feature film where we do HDR first. It just doesn't happen because of time. But it would be nice because you're with the largest range and you see what colors are in your highlights. If you're doing a scene that's outside, all your skies are going up being fantastically consistent. If you do SDR or P3 first, like we did on Mission Impossible Fallout, and then you've suddenly got a 4000 nit version, you're like, oh crikey, that's really blue, that's slightly pink, that's a bit less, that's a white sky. And there's a lot more work to do at that stage, where usually they give you 2 days or something crazy to just sort of to give it a quick pass. I mean, that's another thing is, with DPs, again, we don't want 1 or 2 days. We want 4 or 5 days on an episode, particularly episode 1, which has to be the one where you're setting, the first one you do to kind of try and set that look and experiment with things. And not just to be given, well, you need 1 day, one with that, an exec review, and then you're on to the next thing. And then, the kind of other deliverables are just seen as deliverables and a process that you put things through. And they're not that. Each one has to be its own creative journey, really. So that's the difficulty. Dolby Vision is a great system. As I was saying, Dolby version 4, which is being adopted. The analysis and trim will get you much closer in your first work. You won't be sacrificing your highlights or anything. And you've got finer tools for correcting and changing colors. So that, and I will work with 2 X300 monitors, the HDR and the SDR at the same time, showing me that out of the base light. So we're constantly reviewing. You don't need to flick over or change anything. You've got them at the same time. But yeah, I can't believe DPs don't get to know who their post house is when they're filming. It's just crazy.
Hey, so can I ask a question? One of the things I've noticed, having been grading in HDR from my basement, we were using a service called Moxion to review to review the graded thing. So the director wasn't sitting in for 2.5, 3 weeks of the grade. We would send him stuff on Moxion, which was viewable in HDR and SDR, just as a flick of a switch on iPad Pros, and it kind of worked. And the iPad Pro, you know, I'm not convinced by iPads because, especially with the HDR bit, because it kind of, there's secret stuff happening underneath. You can kind of see it happening a bit, especially with the brightness button. You can see it, you can confuse it, I stopped trusting the HDR on the iPad Pro, and I started looking at it in SDR. And interestingly, one of the things that occurred to me is that, you know, right, you're given guidance to turn the brightness when viewing SDR down to 50%. Ish.
Yeah, ish.
I kept on finding it's a bit nicer if I just push it up a bit. And all of a sudden, I was holding my iPad up and looking at the flanges, 25 grams worth of monitor, looking at my little iPad Pro, okay, that's actually really, really close, and that's SDR, and that's that. But it's the brightness within SDR, within our new world, we have all these monitors that can do 600 nits, and we're watching things because we're not paying for the premium in SDR. We're turning the brightness up, and it's sort of, there's a whole bright SDR world sitting out there as well.
There is, Angus, but it hasn't got the tone. That hasn't got the tonality. I'm going to move our debate on now, because I want to touch back on one of the key subjects that we're covering here, which is the art of storytelling, and the art of storytelling through light and color. And if I may, I'm going to bring Roberto in first on this, because I'd like to ask Roberto about a film. For me, I'd like to ask about Quantum of Solace, but I'm very happy for you to volunteer which film it is. And this idea of taking our viewer, our audience, on a journey in which light and color is part of that emotional engagement. And would you like to expand on that subject, Roberto?
Sure. I mean, well, Quantum of Solace is kind of an obvious because of it being so many different countries around the world, and where Bond's character goes through knowing and then finding out he doesn't know and being tricked and all of that. And same thing with the crew and us, because we didn't really have a script. We didn't really know what was happening a lot. But yeah, I mean, when you're in South America and you're in where Haiti, where you're expecting rich colors and depth and all of that, you know, it's using that, it's planning that, and that's got a lot to do with production design and costume design too. It's, you know, we're all in this together. Now, of course, that was shot on 35, as was the last 3 projects that I've done have been shot on 35, and then go, you know, through DI and end up probably on an SDR and an HDR pass. But yeah, I think I won't limit it to Quantum of Solace. I'd say every movie I do, every project I do, I'm considering the tone of the script, the tone of the characters, where their mind is at. I mean, one that's a great feeling for that, and it's a very dark film, and it's a total different thing, is Stay, which is, it's so much going on in the mind that it's tricking you, the audience, into not understanding and not really knowing exactly where we are in space and time. And then you get revealed at the end, and a lot of it is dark. And it plays that way because it just works better being dark. And not being terribly colorful. It sucks you in, it's depressing, and it's got some heaviness to it. So yeah, I mean, I think everybody who does it, I think that's just part of our the obvious, our toolkit, our way of expressing, whether it's Storaro saying we're writing with light, or it's somebody else saying we're painting with light, or we're creating with light, and choice of camera movement and angles and lenses. It's all got to work together, or it's, you know, or it's just, you know, and throw it up in the air and see what sticks.
And Roberto, I love that you brought production design, because I think we're talking about HDR and the palette and so on. Production design, costume, and everything else, makeup, etc. They should be on this boat.
Yes, makeup. I forgot to mention makeup, because if you're working with pulling the chroma out of, you know, exaggerating chroma and here and there, and hair color for the hair designers, it's going to affect that too. That's why when I do camera tests, when I can do camera tests, because believe it or not, we don't always get the chance to do a camera test.
With the films that you're doing, they're not.
Absolutely. Even some of the TV stuff I'm doing, it's, you know, it's like people have said to me, and I really hate to, they'll say, really, somebody of your stature, you don't get, no, stature has nothing to do with it. It has to do with the budget today. It's all about the bottom line. If I'm working on a small movie, I get 2 days of prep. If I'm working on a big one, I might get 3 months. But when I do camera tests, I always ask the production, the costume designer and the production designer and the art director and the set decorator to bring in cloth, to bring in props, to bring in costumes, because and makeup, do it under the lighting we're going to shoot it under.
Yeah.
In the makeup trailer, it's going to shift.
Yeah.
And then I've had some makeup people say, "Well, I know what I'm doing." I said, "Well,
I was sent by Guillermo Navarro in a feature film we were doing together when I was working on set, and he sent me with the gaffer to the makeup truck to change it all. And actually, we rewired the whole thing, and next scene is gonna be tungsten, and they were doing the makeup under the same lighting. And one of the philosophies that we've been working on for our set view, it's okay, HDR, it's fantastic for the cinematographer, but you have all these tiny monitors and viewfinder, etc. All of that is not HDR, it's going to be SDR, so it can be ridiculously confusing. So the same philosophy that we did with Simone, the 17 inches from Sony, it's nearly a replica of the X300 from Sony. Okay, it's tiny, but that's only for the cinematographer, and it's on the DAT card. What we are working on is to find the most cost-effective HDR for the gallery, for the script supervisor, for all the makeup department. I think those are the ones that they must have an HDR monitoring on set. Cinematographers, you all know how light works. You have your eyes. That's the best HDR monitor you're ever gonna have. Just close one eye.
I always,
if I made that,
I always invite the makeup artist and the costume to come into the DIT tent when we start a scene, a setup. I say, come in, don't be ashamed, don't be afraid. Come in and watch what it really looks like, because you're not going to see it on that little monitor you've got.
Pablo, could you use an iPad Pro?
The second generation, yes. Yes, you certainly do. I've put it side by side with the reference monitor, and it's very good. But as you said, the slider, you need to keep it in 50. I think Anthony and Asa wanted to...
Yeah, just 2 quick things. One on the iPad Pro, the problem with the instructions we had when viewing HDR was that you should put it to 100%. That's the nightmare, because you'll get 600 nits or whatever, but you lose all contrast ratio in your dark scenes because of the backlight. So we would then look at nighttime horror scenes. Yeah. And you can't see anything, it becomes mud. So we did so many tests. My God, I was watching HDR on my 65-inch telly. I had an SDR iPad Pro, an HDR iPad Pro, in and out with those, and found that the 50 to 65% is a sweet spot. That's where the image will still look good. You won't get super bright things on it, but that's where it looks right.
In a dark environment. In a dark
environment. If you're on a train, and I mean, someone said the other day, but I'm going to have won't they watch it brightly on a train? They're not going to watch a horror film on a train. If you try and watch it, you find you won't be able to see it, and you'll watch something else. Sorry, the other thing was about Roberto was saying on season 1 of The Crown, we were Adriana Goldman was going back to makeup and saying this lipstick is not working with the grade that we're trying. It's going quite magenta, and I didn't want to isolate and track lips for 10 hours of TV, which I've done before. And they kept saying, we work from stills, we work from Polaroids. And we're like, that's not what it's going to look like. And eventually we did get them to come in, and they tried maybe 20, 25 different lipsticks before we got the one that worked right for them once it was on TV. So that's Roberto's absolutely right. Cloth, textures, colors, makeup, it's vital, so that when it gets to the grade, you can spend your time, just getting it right, enhancing things, not fixing things, because you don't want to waste 2 or 3 days fixing lipstick or a costume color.
I mean, magenta, the joys of magenta and skin tones and the wrong makeup.
Anthony.
Yes.
No, I would just, to kind of follow up on that, most people, everyone's going for some type of a film feel, right? That's the general feel for the most part. They want a film look. And you have to treat your look, your LMT, all of that as negative. You have to treat that as a film stock and shoot your test appropriately. You have to say the hue, the hue on this dress is going to look different, and then have all of production involved in this process. If you're not doing that, if you're not doing any of those things, you're going to sit in your DI session and be stressed about, because someone's going to come in and go, oh, I don't think that pink was the right color of that lapel, and then as are going to be rotoing that pink thing. And it saves you time to allow for that creative process when you take the time, and going back to what we were talking about, prepping all of that. Yeah. And as far as all the other cinematographers in the talk, I find that I fall into that same category of, I get a film dropped in my lap a lot of times, where they come to me and they go, hey, we shot this, we don't really like how, we have a LUT, and I'm like, okay, and they're like, yeah, look at this LUT, and I'm like, okay, well, you're doing a Netflix show, and we're transferring an HDR, so your SDR LUT it's not really going to work, so we have to reconstruct.
If I talk to Netflix, so I talk to Phil Oatley or Michael Keegan, they will all say that they want HDR monitoring on set. That as an absolute as a requirement.
It's expensive.
Yeah, it is, but sorry, I hate to. There are HDR monitoring now, which is going down in price, and we've plugged Sony a number of times over this piece, but they have actually got a new range of monitors. I've had the pleasure of working with them. They're called PVMX, and they're small. It's an 18-inch, I think, is about 6,000, coming in at about 6,000. So you're not taking a BVM HX310 or X300, which is 30-something thousand, out for 3 months on a shoot. And if you then translate that into what Teradek are doing as well with the Max, the Bolt Max, and the Bolt 4K, you're getting an HDR, it's a 42, but you're getting an HDR 10 PQ on a monitor at up to 60 frames per second with very limited latency. We're actually moving to a world where HDR monitoring on set, for the DIT, for the cinematographers, it will shortly become a reality. It's going in the right direction. £6,000 is
for the rest of the crew as well, and there are ways of doing it in a more inexpensive way. We've actually found ways of using Dolby Vision within the set with HDMI screens, so they don't need to be SDI super duper monitors. That with proper calibration, you can get a very good, affordable HDR experience on set.
You've seen this monitor as well. I know you have, Pablo.
Yeah, but still $6,000 and $11,000.
Yeah, it's still expensive.
How about the Atomos?
The Atomos are pretty good.
Yep.
They have a 19-inch.
Yeah, blacks, but the contrast ratio is
out of interest on that, because I shot this Netflix movie and knowing it was for Netflix, knowing it was going to be a Dolby Vision, I sort of insisted on HDR monitoring. And out of interest, when I did this was about half a year ago, there are only 2 monitors that Netflix themselves said are approved as far as they were concerned for on-set production. I don't know if that's changed, but the one I had was a Flanders, and it's like the XM311K.
Yep.
Yeah, but that's $30,000. Those are reference monitors. I think what Netflix says with that approved is for mastering, for the job of Anthony and Asa.
That's what I thought. They insisted I had it on set, so I said fine.
Well, if they let you, hey.
Yeah, exactly. It was great. Yeah.
But it is going to become increasingly a requirement, and the price of them is going down, and I'm taking that PVMX. The beauty is it does match, barring the blacks. It matches, the color rendition is the same as for the HX310 or the X300, which is, I think you've got an X300. Is that right? In your suite, Asa?
Yep. Two of them. I had 4 in a few weeks ago, which is because of
display real estate.
Because of social distancing, clients had to be, 2 meters away at the back, separate. Yeah. And I didn't want to chance different 55-inch TVs and one having a, so we all had X300s.
Raf, I'm going to bring you in. Raf, what are you grading on?
X300 and also the Flanders 4000.
Yeah.
I just did a show for Apple TV called Helpsters, and it's a kid show, very vibrant, very colorful, and Apple wanted to master at 4,000 nits.
Wow.
So we did
Wow.
4,000, 1,000, 600, and then an SDR.
Wow.
I've only done once 4,000 and it hurt.
It's firing on the eyes. I'll tell you that.
I've seen the Dolby and it hurts. It really does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Can I just say something on the hurt thing? Is that a couple of years ago when we started out doing HDR and things were bright and specular highlights or car lights in the distance on a bridge were piercing and felt like CG.
Yeah.
We had very few tools to be able to do anything other than just bring the highlights down, and the whole thing might be muddy or work with a curve. But what Filmlight have done with the base light is put a couple of tools in there that are brilliant for HDR when you've got these bright or distracting highlights, candles or anything. One is texture highlight, where you can select that highlight a little bit like a key, but work a roll off, and it will just slightly halate or soften with diffusion those points. And just doing a touch of that, you then don't have to affect the rest of the image. The other one is texture detail. Can't quite remember the name of it, but where you've got different frequencies of resolving pixels, as it were. So anything that resolves at 4K, you can then increase the sharpness or soften it slightly, or at 2K or at 1K and going down. So using those two tools can massage an over sharp, super bright image with those details down into a more filmic soft thing and yet still have things at 600 or 700 or 800 nits. So it's great that those people are still writing tools to help us make these images, make them work, because
it's ongoing, as I was saying before, with the algorithms trying to do the perceptual matches and so on, that part of the philosophy. And I gotta say, I did an error with the 4,000 nit. The 4,000 nit, it's meant to be watched with your windows open. I did it in a dark room. That's
you need hazard pay.
No, not really. I mean, the headache I had it was insane. But that's the error. A 4,000 nit master, you should be with your windows open. That's what the audience is watching, that with full windows open, full sun. So that's because it's very important, the viewing environment and looking after the viewing environment. I've tend to rise up my ambient light on the studio when I'm working on HDR.
So Pablo, what happens to your shadows in that? Because if it's a bit of a rabbit in the headlight situation. So, if you're looking at something at 4,000 nits, even with the windows open or the curtains drawn or undrawn, all of a sudden, all the shadows your eyes are gonna stop down to deal with that really bright backlight window, and all of a sudden you're gonna have to open up the blacks and open up the blacks and lift it. And so if you were just to cover the window, the bright bit in the frame, they're just going to look appalling. How does that all work? I mean, because that was an experience I had within my grade, and we were only working to 800. That actually, we were doing tricks of vignettes and soft contrast vignettes to try and focus the attention, but that was one of the struggles. And when you get into sort of sexy vintage lenses that have a tendency to flare a little bit.
Oh no!
Oh,
don't even get there. With the blacks, all of these 4,000 nit monitors are LCDs, so the blacks are not too good. Being completely honest, so there was not really a problem. And in this case, it was for live sports. As an experiment, and I did the error of doing it in a dark room, but it was like, okay, no, this needs to be done this other way.
I'd like to chip in here. We got very little time to run here, and I want to hear from all of our panelists before we do a final wrap and a good morning, a good night, and a God bless. And before we do that, so I'm going to start, if I may. We're going to start with Anthony Raffaele. Anthony, I'm going to ask you each in turn your advice about a take-home point for our viewers to take home and to apply. What would be if you were to say one thing about working in HDR, one thing that you'd ask the people you work with to think about, what would that be, Anthony?
To test, to really test, and know going in how comfortable you are with HDR, and talk to your colorist about it and your DIT. Because if you're not comfortable with it, you should definitely become comfortable with it. Call your favorite colorist that you need a favor from and say, hey, listen, I shot this footage. I want to become more comfortable with HDR. I want to see what the highlights do when I raise it. I want to see how you can roll them back down. All these things. You just becoming comfortable with HDR is probably the best takeaway for cinematographers in general.
Okay, I'm gonna hand over the same question. Who's going to be next? It's going to be Eben Bolter. Please, your takeaway. Thinking about the people you work with, what would you say to them about working in HDR?
It's probably just because you can doesn't mean you should. I think it's still that's from Jurassic Park, I think. But, you know, the same way with dinosaurs.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, you know, make the image yours. You've got that extra space to use if you wish. Don't feel that you have to.
Angus, I'm going to ask you the same question. And having just sat there in your room, tell me, what would you, if you wanted to impart one piece of wisdom, what would that one piece of wisdom be about working in HDR?
Two pieces of wisdom. Make sure your production can afford it. And then get Pablo, Asa, Anthony, Simone, and Roberto and Eben and me to shoot your film for you.
I'm in.
Very good advice. I'm going to pass on the same question. We're going to come to Roberto. Roberto Schaefer, please, your final thought on HDR and your experience of HDR, which has been after the event a little bit. So I'm going to ask you, what would be your take home?
Well, I have the fortune of taking home everything that these three guys said before me, which I agree with everything they've said. I think it's also, I would just request, no matter what size the production is, if they know we're going to go to HDR, and even if they don't, that we have at least one HDR monitor with the DIT. And I will invite everybody else to come in and see it, but it's so important to at least know what you're getting into. Just have that. And let them, don't try to tell you it's too expensive. There's always money that they're spending on champagne in the stars trailers or whatever it is, that they can be smart. Because as they said, prep is the most important thing in a movie for me. I want to know what's going on. So I want to see it in prep and I want to see it on set.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I agree entirely. Simone, I'm going to ask you the same question. I hope you've had a chance to think about an answer. Simone, your one piece of advice.
Well, I think the most important thing is to study what is HDR, to know what you can do with this, what you can create. And I don't think it's really expensive at the end. You need just one monitor HDR. You don't need, you know, in my opinion, actually. You don't need, and as Roberto said, you can invite people and see what your movie appears in HDR. So just study and know how to use it. That's my.
Asa, I'm gonna hand over to you, Asa.
Well,
you have the
I think
right. You can't disagree with everyone.
I think mine's slightly different. Mine's from a shooting point of view, and it slightly goes to what Gus was saying, that if you're going to shoot someone against a window or a sky, you need an HD monitor on set, or if you don't, you've got to realize they're going to appear that they're in silhouette, even if they're not, because sometimes you get it, you zoom right into their face and you can see all the detail. But like Gus was saying, your eye brackets down and they appear to be silhouette. That could be perfect, but you've just got to know how bright that sky can now be. I mean, we can bring it down, but I think that's the biggest challenge I've had. Yeah, and windows next to people, but how bright things can be, distracting, and that relationship between a lit or unlit face and a window. It can be fantastic, but that's often where HDR becomes a negative and can be really a difficult or dangerous tool.
And then it looks really dodgy to bring it back.
And then it can look really odd and flat and weird, and how can we do this sky? And I end up doing lots of sky replacements for exactly that reason. I've got a library of them and we go, well, this one's just distracting, too bright, too flat a day. Let's get something in so we can now concentrate on the face. That's the main thing.
Someone said to me, and you can, I'd welcome your thoughts. Someone said to me that when you're exposed for SDR and you have a candle in front of a face and you're exposing for SDR, you're exposed for the face. When you're exposed in HDR, you're exposed for the candle. Have you heard that? Have you heard that phrase?
Well, it's interesting because I've just been doing this series, which is set in the 1890s, and there are candles everywhere. There are far too many candles, but there are candles everywhere. And I was just thinking, I wish a flame could be darker. Or could we tell them to use lamps instead, or some way to take the luminance of the candle down? Because I'm working on all these candles and these high bright things, wanting to subdue them. The work they're doing is beautiful. I mean, Afonso Beato said that he would have a 60-watt light bulb in a light because he wanted it to do its thing in a practical, but he would put something inside the shade because he didn't want it to burn through. And if only we could do that with other light sources, that's the secret, really. And it's just working on that relationship between those bright light sources and what they're doing to what you want them to do to a face, and suddenly what they're just doing to draw your eye away.
Yeah, I'm going to give the last word to Pablo Garcia. You have, I know. Well, actually, I'm going to have the last word after you, but you know,
as usual,
you have the last authoritative word, right? You have the last authoritative word.
Use it dynamically. Think on HDR as a dynamic tool. Read it on the script. Some parts of your story are going to be less dynamic range than others, and that's to your own benefit. And these are things that in SDR were not that easy to do, but you should read it on the script.
I'm going to wrap here. I'm going to say a very, very big thank you to what has been an extraordinary panel. We could go on all night, I know. I certainly can. So I'm going to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Simone D'arcangelo. Wonderful having you here. Wonderful meeting you. Thank you. Anthony Raffaele, I'm looking forward to that beer when you're next in London. Pablo Garcia, of course, always lovely to see you, and I'm sure I'll see you soon. Asa Shoul, a pleasure. Please, guys, a quick plug, that film on televisual.com with Asa and Rob. It gives you a lot of information about working in HDR, and I hope there's a lot more to come there as well. Angus, Hudson, a pleasure having you there. Thank you for joining us. Roberto Schaefer, fantastic to have you on board, an honor. And finally, Eben Bolter, wonderful. It's a fantastic panel. Thank you all. Thank you all for your contributions. Thank you, Mission and Wildcat, for making this happen. And as Televisual and as Sim, we're delighted to be part of it. Thank you so much. And